But what I really wanted to do was speak to somebody who has got a lot of experience and I think a lot of perspective on this. Timothy Kirkhope was a Conservative MP for the Leeds North East seat, a government minister, was previously on the EU Security and Justice Subcommittee. He served for many years as a Euro MP, representing Yorkshire and the Humber, and in the House of Lords, Lord Kirkhope of Harrogate. So I hope he'll mind, because he won't mind, because we've spoken many times over the years. If I say Happy New Year, Timothy, and very good to speak to you. How are you?
Happy New Year to you as well, Andrew. Pleased to be here. And although there are tricky things to talk about, I know.
Well, there are, and that's why I thought it'd be nice to have a bit of perspective on this, because this is a very tricky line to walk. So just give me a gut reaction on where we're at the moment, which is a whole series of strikes in a whole series of different areas of public life.
Yeah, I think it's extremely difficult at the moment, but I fully understand. First of all, whether you would expect me to be sympathetic with some of the people who are on strike, I'm not sure, but I have a general sympathy with the pressures from the economy on a whole range of people in different occupations. I'm particularly concerned about the lower paid members of different occupations. There are some people in those areas who are quite well paid, but pressures of the inflation that we're seeing at the moment, pressures of the economy, inevitably worry people to a very great extent. And from the point of view of those who organize them, that is the heads of unions in particular, it is an opportunity, an important opportunity for them to assert the position of their members in order to try and benefit them and get more money for them to try and meet some of that inflation which is harming them. So I can see, in the broad context, I can see all of this, and it's not new. I mean, you very kindly mentioned, Andrew, you actually were quite polite because you didn't mention how long I've been around, but I've been in politics for a heck of a long time, serving Yorkshire, and I have seen strikes before. So these aren't the first strikes, and nor are they the first examples of inflation and a difficult economy and pressures on people's everyday lives. So, there's nothing new in that, but I think that we now do have a situation where there is a broad concern which needs probably to be addressed a bit more than is happening on a sort of piecemeal basis at the moment.
Well, I was well aware of your long experience, and that was why particularly I was keen to speak to you about this, because I think perspective is interesting, because I, for example, work with a number of colleagues who've not seen industrial action, who perhaps aren't necessarily as clear as they might be on even the role of trade unions. And some people may be surprised to hear, here's a Conservative politician expressing sympathy for the broad aims and actions that are happening here. And yet on the other side of it, you'll have people who can't get to work, people who may be missing medical appointments, businesses that are saying my Christmas has been ruined because there was so much uncertainty about whether people will be able to travel into town to have that worked Christmas do, or whatever it may be. If you don't work, it disrupts somebody else, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And of course, some of the areas here where we're seeing action taken are those that actually have the greatest impact. And of course, if you are a trade union leader, inevitably, if you're going to take strike action or your members are going to take strike action, you want to make sure that it is, I'm afraid, disruptive. Because if it's not disruptive, if it has no effect at all on anybody, then, the impact of doing it, or bearing in mind that, of course, the members who are on strike in most cases are not being paid while they're on strike. So again, the extra pressure of not being in work is harming them as well. So you've got to make sure that there is, if you like, I say disruption, but there certainly has to be some impact. Otherwise, there is no point in striking.
That's a good point. I'm just going to interrupt you there because I was speaking to a friend, bumped into him in the shops in Headingley, who'd been off a huge amount of days because he is working for the post office. And that's another area that we've not mentioned. I had an important legal document that didn't reach the solicitor for 3.5 weeks and was finally told yesterday it had reached it after my mum's death. And that just brought home, in terms of an important bit of paper, what disruption means. Let's turn it around the other way there. We're not seeing a lot of movement from the Conservative government at the moment, because we keep hearing the rail unions say, for example, we're very happy to talk about things if you actually discuss a meaningful pay rise, or the nurses or whoever else it might be. So what's happening there? Because if you have a strike, you then hopefully, I would have thought the idea is that you get round a table. We always talk about the proverbial table, and you give a bit and they give a bit, and hopefully you meet in the middle and the whole thing's over. So where are we at the moment?
Well, I mean, the government have actually moved in the last 24 hours to say that they want to have meetings with the key leaders, as it were, next Monday, on Monday coming, which is an enormous change to the situation. But I mean, I have great sympathy for those who operate our treasury, as it were, those who are operating the economy of the country, because I know that if in fact inflationary increases are given, even if there is some merit in them, then inevitably all that does is to, if you like, push up the cost of living, push up the effects on everybody, but also on those people who are getting those increases. They then find that after a little while, they're worth very little to them if the economy doesn't actually go down in terms of its inflation and so on. So I think there is obviously a major issue here in terms of having to resist and not allow too much to be granted. If you talk about wage increases, people are talking about percentages now, which are enormous.
Well, like the nurses, 19%, for example, is a figure that's been quoted many times, isn't it?
I know, and no one could sympathise more with nurses than I do. And I know that, for instance, we're now getting a situation where, and it's today's Yorkshire Post I have in front of me here, and the junior doctors on the headline here are going to ballot to see if they now want to join in a strike. So it seems to me that there is a considerable problem here which needs to be solved. And I'm glad the government are at least agreeing to talk to the leaders of these various unions and so on, representative bodies, on Monday. That, I hope, is going to produce some kind of outcome. But I have to say, the problem we've got is this. And years and years ago, I was involved, not in Yorkshire, but even before I came to Yorkshire, I was involved as a member of the ambulance committee of the Northern Health Authority, where we dealt every single year with what we called then, I think it wasn't called a pay review body, but it was set up in order to avoid the kind of political side of negotiations of increases in wages. And those bodies did their work very well. But I'm now come to the conclusion, with all this going on, pay review bodies exist. The government has said, they've moved behind them to say, it's not for us to negotiate directly. It's for the pay review bodies to come up with their independent assessment. And they have done. And the government accepted that. But of course, it has not taken into account. The last time the pay review bodies met, I think, were in February last year. It has not taken into account the latest increases in inflation. And therefore, in many ways, I now think, this is my personal view, I'm probably not shared by everybody, is that we ought to have pay review bodies that are actually operating on a rolling basis. So, I mean, the next meetings of these bodies will be this February. So it isn't very long before they'll be able to look again at these various sort of areas of wages and so on. But I think we ought to have some kind of rolling situation here.
So if inflation is, as it has been doing, spiralling, perhaps 6 months? 3 months even? I mean, that would be an astonishing situation, wouldn't it?
Well, I think it may be that it would be much better if we did that. And because the other thing about pay review bodies is that they work remotely. So each one of these little sectors has its own pay review body with its own membership and its own considerations and so on. I think in many ways that's a good idea. But if you've got an overall economy problem like we have, you've got inflation running in this way, then unless there is some kind of relationship between the bodies, then of course you're going to get situations where one sector with a very strong trade union, for instance, is going to be able to argue outside of the body, as it were, for much more money for its members because it knows that it has the tool of strike action available.
How interesting. What a fascinating debate. You and I could talk all morning. I think you've given our listeners plenty of room for thought there. Can I just ask you finally, and this goes much further back than either of us, there was talk last year of whether we'd end up with a general strike. This is Lord Kirkhope, Timothy Kirkhope, former Leeds North East MP, government minister, Euro MP, etc., now in the House of Lords. there was talk of a general strike. We seem to be a way off that. And yet, if you're trying to catch a train, you've not had one really in the new year at all, or any reliability of one. You might be worried about what's happening in the health service. My daughter's waiting for a driving test. So, is she going to get a driving test with the examiners off? The postal workers, etc. Do you see a prospect of that, just very quickly?
Right. Well, I mean, some of the unions, and particularly I think those that are more militant, the more political unions, have said that they would like to see coordinated action between the various factions in order to force the government to give overall larger or to approve larger pay increases in the public sector. My own view is that that actually then takes us into the field, I'm afraid, of rather stark politics. And I don't want us to do that. I hope that the government understands that. I think it does. I hope the unions understand that as well. And I don't think there is a mood in the country, particularly with the pressures on a lot of people who do not have the support of strong unions to help them, people who are suffering at the moment as a result of action taken. I don't think there is a mood in the country that would be supportive of that. And I hope it doesn't happen. And I think it would be wrong. And as I said to you before, the key point here is obviously to get the government to improve the economy, to get inflation down. And in the meantime, I'm afraid we're all suffering, whether it be from the point of view of wages or indeed from the effects of these actions that are being taken by certain factions.
It's been very good to speak. Thank you for your time this morning. Perspective, I think, is what we needed, and I hope we've got it this morning. Really nice. Happy New Year, Timothy Kirkhope.
Happy New Year, Andrew.
Thank you. There we are, Lord Kirkhope of Harrogate, with a perspective on the industrial action we've got at the moment and where we're at. And we didn't even get on to that other issue of whether there may be some restriction on certain forms of striking. It's not, it's thought, going to affect the industrial action we've got this winter because it has to go through the House of Lords. It would have perhaps to face legal challenges and the rest. But I'd love to hear, as ever, what you've got to say.